The world was a smear of gray rock and the biting scent of sagebrush, each jolt of the horse a fresh torment to Elara's side. Blood, warm and sticky, seeped through the rough spin fabric of her dress, a stark crimson flower blooming over the dull ache that had become the center of her universe. The bullet, it was still in there. A malevolent seed planted by a man who had promised to love and cherish her. A hollow laugh, sharp and brittle, died in her throat. Promises were just words, poison-coated and sweet until they turned in your belly. Her horse, a skittish bay mare named Mercy, stumbled, its breath coming in ragged bursts. Elara clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, her vision swimming. The desert stretched before her, an unforgiving canvas of muted browns and greens, the sun a merciless hammer in the vast indifferent sky. She had to keep going. To stop was to die, either by the hand of the man she'd fled or by the slow, patient cruelty of the wilderness. Another wave of dizziness washed over her, and this time she couldn't fight it. The reins slipped from her grasp and the world tilted on its axis. She was falling. A slow, languid tumble into the dust and the thorns. The impact jarred the bullet, and a scream, thin and reedy, tore from her lips. She lay there, the sun beating down on her, the silence of the desert broken only by the frantic thud of her own heart. It was the sound of hoofbeats that roused her, slow and steady, not the frantic pursuit she'd been expecting. Through a haze of pain, she saw a figure on a massive black stallion, a silhouette against the blinding sun. A giant of a man, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sky, his hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her pain. It was one of them, one of her husband's men, sent to drag her back to that gilded cage she'd called a home. She fumbled for the small derringer tucked into her garter, her fingers clumsy and slick with her own blood. The man dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his hands held out in a gesture of peace. But she'd been fooled by peaceful gestures before. She raised the gun, her arm trembling with the effort. "Stay back," she croaked, the words barely a whisper. The man stopped, his gaze falling to the spreading stain on her dress. He didn't seem to notice the gun, or if he did, he paid it no mind. He was close enough now that she could see the lines etched around his eyes, the grim set of his mouth. He wasn't one of her husband's men. They were all soft, with cruel, sneering faces. This man was hewn from the rock of the mountains, his face a testament to a life lived under the harsh sun and unforgiving winds. "You're hurt," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. "I'm fine," she lied, the word catching in her throat. He took another step and she cocked the hammer of the derringer, the click echoing in the stillness. "I said stay back." He ignored her, his eyes fixed on her wound. "That bullet needs to come out." He was a mountain of a man, and she was a broken bird at his feet. The derringer suddenly felt like a child's toy in her hand. He knelt beside her, his presence a strange mixture of intimidating and comforting. He reached for the hem of her dress, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Let me see," he said, his voice softer now, a low murmur that soothed the ragged edges of her fear. She flinched but didn't pull away. She was too weak, too tired to fight anymore. He carefully tore the fabric, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft. He exposed the wound, a puckered, angry hole oozing blood. His breath hissed out between his teeth. "It's clean," he said, his voice tight. "But it needs to come out. Now!" He looked at her then, his eyes a startling shade of blue in his sun-weathered face. They were kind eyes, she realized with a jolt, eyes that held a hint of a sorrow that mirrored her own. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice a solemn vow. "I'm going to help you." She wanted to believe him. Oh, how she wanted to believe him. But trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Still, what choice did she have? To refuse his help was to accept her fate, a slow, agonizing death in the dust. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A flicker of relief crossed his face. He stood and walked back to his horse, returning with a canteen and a leather roll. He unrolled it to reveal a set of surgical instruments gleaming in the harsh sunlight, her heart hammered against her ribs. He knelt beside her again, his large frame casting a shadow over her, shielding her from the relentless sun. He uncorked the canteen and poured some of the water onto a clean cloth. "This is going to hurt," he said, his voice a gentle warning. She braced herself, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. He began to clean the wound, his touch firm but careful. The sting of the water on the raw flesh made her cry out, a sharp, involuntary sound. "I know," he soothed, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "I know." He worked quickly, his movements economical and precise. He was a man who knew his way around a wound. As he worked, he spoke to her, his voice a steady presence in the swirling chaos of her pain. "My name is Jedediah," he said. "Jedediah Stone." She didn't respond. Her focus narrowed to the searing pain in her side. He didn't seem to expect a response, his words a gentle stream that washed over her, a distraction from the agony. "You're safe now," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her pain. "I won't let anyone hurt you." And in that moment, in the heart of the unforgiving desert, with a stranger's hands tending to her wound, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren landscape of her heart. The world resolved itself into a kaleidoscope of shifting images. The stark blue sky, the grimly focused face of the giant cowboy, the glint of steel in his hand. Elara's breath hitched, a ragged, painful sound in the oppressive silence. The bullet, he was going to take it out. Here, now, with nothing but a knife and his own rough-hewn brand of mercy. "Hold still," Jedediah's voice was a low rumble, a steadying presence in the maelstrom of her fear. He held a small, wicked-looking blade in his hand, the steel sterilized with whiskey from a flask he'd produced from his saddlebag. The sharp, alcoholic scent of it mingled with the metallic tang of her own blood. She wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, to let her die in peace. But the words were a tangled knot in her throat, and all that escaped was a pathetic whimper. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers, and for a fleeting moment she saw a flicker of something that looked like empathy. "I'll be gentle," he promised, his voice a soft murmur that was at odds with his formidable size. "But it will hurt. Bite on this." He offered her a strip of leather, and she took it, her teeth sinking into the worn, supple hide. The first touch of the cold steel against her fevered skin was a shock, a prelude to the agony she knew was coming. She closed her eyes, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather, her body tensing in anticipation. And then it came, a searing, white-hot pain that lanced through her, eclipsing everything else. A scream muffled by the leather tore from her throat, and her back arched off the hard ground. "Easy now." Jedediah's voice was a low, steady mantra, a lifeline in the swirling vortex of her pain. "Almost there. Just a little more." She could feel the gruesome probing of the knife, the sickening sensation of it moving inside her. Tears streamed from her closed eyes, carving clean paths through the grime on her face. The world narrowed to that single point of excruciating agony, and she was adrift in a sea of it, with only the giant cowboy's voice to cling to. And then, just when she thought she could bear it no more, it was over. She felt a final sharp tug and the pressure was gone. A wave of relief so profound it was almost as painful as the agony that had preceded it washed over her. She went limp, her body slick with sweat, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She opened her eyes to see Jedediah holding a small, misshapen piece of lead in his hand. The bullet, her husband's parting gift. A bitter, ironic laugh bubbled up in her chest, a hysterical sound that was half sob, half laugh. Jedediah's face was a mask of grim concentration as he worked, his large hands surprisingly deft as he stitched the wound closed with a needle and thread from his kit. He worked with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a man who was no stranger to violence and its aftermath. He was a man of the West, a man who knew how to mend what was broken, whether it was a fence post or a woman's shattered body. When he was finished, he bandaged the wound with a strip of clean cloth from his saddlebag. He worked in silence now, the only sounds the rustle of the cloth and the ragged rhythm of her own breathing. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, his gaze sweeping over her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He offered her the canteen and she drank, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his thoughts a mystery behind the stoic mask of his face. She was at his mercy, a wounded animal he had found in the wilderness. He could do with her as he pleased. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw not cruelty or malice, but a quiet strength and a surprising gentleness. "Thank you," she whispered, the words hoarse and inadequate. He gave a curt nod, his gaze dropping to the ground as if her gratitude was an embarrassment to him. He was a man of action, not words. a man who did what needed to be done without expectation of thanks or reward. He stood, his large frame blocking out the sun. "We need to get you out of this sun," he said, his voice gruff. "There's a line shack not too far from here. It's not much, but it's shelter." He walked to his horse, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were trying not to startle her. He returned with a blanket, which he gently draped over her. He then scooped her up into his arms, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. She was as light as a feather in his powerful embrace, and for the first time in a long time she felt a flicker of something that resembled safety. He carried her to his horse, a magnificent black stallion that seemed to dwarf her own mare. With a grunt of effort, he lifted her onto the saddle, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. He then mounted behind her, his large body a solid wall at her back. "Hold on," he said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. She leaned back against him, her body boneless with exhaustion. He clicked his tongue, and the great horse moved forward, its gait smooth and steady. She closed her eyes, the rhythmic sway of the horse and the steady beat of the giant cowboy's heart against her back lulling her into a state of semi-consciousness. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The desert, so harsh and unforgiving under the midday sun, was transformed into a place of breathtaking beauty. But Elara was oblivious to it all, lost in a fevered dreamscape of pain and fear. The only reality was the solid presence of the man behind her, the giant cowboy who had plucked her from the jaws of death and was now carrying her to an unknown future. The lion shack was a humble affair, a small one-room cabin built of rough-hewn logs, a testament to the harsh, unforgiving nature of the land. It was nestled in a small grove of cottonwood trees, a tiny oasis of green in the vast expanse of the desert. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a welcome sight to Elara's weary eyes. Jedediah dismounted, his movement slow and careful as he helped her down from the horse. Her legs were weak and unsteady, and she would have fallen if not for his strong arm around her waist. He half carried her to the cabin, his large frame a shield against the growing chill of the evening air. The inside of the cabin was Spartan but clean, a simple cot with a straw-stuffed mattress, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace that was the heart of the small dwelling. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. Jedediah gently lowered her onto the cot, his touch surprisingly tender. He fussed over her for a moment, adjusting the blanket and propping a pillow behind her head. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a protector, a caregiver, a gentle giant who had taken it upon himself to mend her broken body and, perhaps, her shattered spirit. He moved about the small cabin with a quiet efficiency, his large frame surprisingly graceful in the confined space. He put a pot of coffee on to boil over the fire and then began to prepare a simple meal of beans and bacon. The smell of the food, rich and savory, filled the small cabin, a welcome contrast to the metallic tang of blood that had been her constant companion for what felt like an eternity. He brought her a plate of food, his large, calloused hand surprisingly steady as he held it out to her. She wasn't hungry, but she ate, knowing she needed to regain her strength. He sat in the chair opposite her, his own plate untouched, his gaze fixed on the fire. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was a shared silence, a quiet understanding that passed between 2 people who had been touched by the harsh realities of life. She had been a victim of a cruel man's apathetic violence. He, she suspected, had his own scars, both visible and hidden. Who was he? Jedediah's voice, when it came, was a low rumble that startled her. She looked up from her plate, her fork halfway to her mouth. She didn't have to ask who he meant, the man who had put the bullet in her. Her husband, the man she had once promised to love, honor, and obey. A bitter taste rose in her throat. "My husband," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. Jedediah's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. He didn't say anything, but she could see the anger in his eyes, a cold, hard fury that was all the more intimidating for its quiet intensity. "His name is Silas," she continued, the name a poison on her tongue. "Silas Croft." Jedediah's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something else. Recognition. He knew the name. "Silas Croft," he repeated, his voice a low growl. "The cattle baron from Blackstone." She nodded, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. Silas was a powerful man, his influence stretching far and wide. He would not take her defiance lightly. He would hunt her down, and when he found her, he would make her pay. "He's a powerful man," Jedediah said, his voice grim. "He has men everywhere." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "But I couldn't stay. I would have rather died." Jedediah's gaze softened, the anger in his eyes replaced by a look of profound sadness. He stood and walked to the fireplace, his back to her. He stared into the flames for a long moment, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the world seemingly on his broad back. "You're safe here," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. "He won't find you here." She wanted to believe him, but the fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Silas was a man who always got what he wanted, and he wanted her. She was his property, his possession, and he would not rest until he had her back under his thumb. "You don't know him," she said, her voice a desperate plea. "He's a monster." Jedediah turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a fierce protective light. "I know his kind," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "and I won't let him touch you." He was a giant of a man, a force of nature in his own right. But Silas was a different kind of monster, a man whose power was not in his fists, but in his wealth and his influence. He could buy and sell men like Jedediah, and he would not hesitate to do so to get what he wanted. "You can't fight him," she said, her voice full of despair. "He'll destroy you." Jedediah crossed the room in 2 long strides, his large frame looming over her. He knelt before her, his hands on the arms of her chair, his face inches from hers. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, bored into hers, and she could see the unwavering resolve in them. "Let him try," he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. "I've faced monsters before." And in that moment, looking into the eyes of the giant cowboy, Elara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. A fragile, tentative thing, but it was there. A tiny spark in the darkness of her despair. She was no longer alone. She had a protector, a champion, a gentle giant who had vowed to stand between her and the monster who haunted her past. The night was a tapestry of unfamiliar sounds. The hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote, the gentle rustle of the wind in the cottonwood trees. Elara lay on the cot, her body a dull ache, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. The fire in the hearth had died down to a soft orange glow, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of the small cabin. Jedediah sat in the chair by the fire, a silent sentinel in the darkness. He had insisted on taking the chair, giving her the only bed in the cabin. He had not slept, she knew. Every time she had stirred, his head had come up, his gaze sharp and alert, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol holstered at his hip. He was a man who lived on the edge of danger, a man who slept with one eye open. She watched him through slitted eyes, the play of the firelight on his rugged features. He was a man of contradictions, a giant with a gentle touch, a warrior with a caregiver's heart. He was a mystery, a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. But one thing was certain. He was a good man, a man who had saved her life, who had offered her shelter and protection without asking for anything in return. A sudden sharp pain in her side made her gasp, and she instinctively reached for the wound. Jedediah was at her side in an instant, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low, anxious rumble. "It's just a twinge," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. He gently pushed her hand away, his touch firm but careful. He examined the bandage, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's bleeding again," he said, his voice tight with worry. "I need to change the dressing." He moved about the small cabin with a quiet efficiency, his movements sure and steady. He lit a lantern, the soft yellow light pushing back the shadows. He brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, his large hands surprisingly deft as he worked. He carefully unwrapped the bandage, his touch as gentle as a summer breeze. The wound was angry and inflamed, a stark reminder of the violence she had escaped. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she closed her eyes, her stomach churning. "Easy now." Jedediah's voice was a low, soothing murmur, a steady presence in the swirling chaos of her pain and fear. "It's not as bad as it looks." He cleaned the wound with a gentle circular motion, his touch firm but careful. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. When he was done, he applied a fresh dressing, his movements economical and precise. "You're feverish," he said, his voice laced with concern. He placed a large, cool hand on her forehead, and she leaned into his touch, a sigh of relief escaping her lips. His hand was a comforting weight, a grounding presence in the turbulent sea of her pain. He sat on the edge of the cot, his gaze fixed on her face. The firelight flickered in his eyes, and she could see a deep, abiding sadness in their depths. He was a man who had known loss, a man who had seen more than his share of suffering. "You should get some rest," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "You haven't slept." He shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "I'll rest when you're out of danger," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. The words hung in the air between them, a promise of protection, a shield against the darkness that threatened to consume her. She was a stranger to him, a wounded bird he had found in the wilderness, and yet he had taken her in, cared for her, and vowed to protect her with his own life. "Why? Where are you doing this?" she asked, the question a whisper in the quiet of the night. He looked away, his gaze falling to the floor. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and unanswered questions. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, heavy with a pain that seemed to come from a place deep within him. "I knew a woman once," he began, his voice barely audible. "She was like you, full of life, with a fire in her spirit that could light up the darkest of rooms." He paused, his jaw tightening, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the cot. The firelight danced on the tears that glistened in his eyes, and Elara's heart ached for him. "I failed her," he said, his voice thick with a self-recrimination that was a physical blow. "I wasn't there when she needed me, and she paid the price." The words hung in the air, heavy with a grief that was almost palpable. He had lost someone he loved, and the wound was still raw, still bleeding, and in her he saw a chance for redemption, a chance to atone for a past failure. "I won't fail you," he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. He looked at her then, his eyes blazing with a protective fire that chased away the shadows in the room and in her heart. "I swear it." And in that moment, in the flickering light of the fire, with the giant cowboy's hand on her forehead, and his solemn vow echoing in the quiet of the night, Elara knew that she was no longer alone. She had found a guardian, a protector, a gentle giant who had taken her under his wing and would not let her fall. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and the looming threat of Silas Croft. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of hope. She had found an unlikely ally in the heart of the unforgiving West, a man who was willing to stand between her and the darkness, a man who had promised to be gentle and had, in his own rough-hewn way, already begun to heal her wounded soul. The days that followed were a blur of fevered dreams and whispered reassurances. Elara drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a hazy, indistinct landscape of pain and fear. The only constant was Jedediah, a steady, unwavering presence at her side. He was her anchor in the stormy sea of her illness, his low, rumbling voice a lifeline in the darkness. He tended to her with a gentle, patient care that belied his formidable size. He bathed her fevered brow with cool water, spooned broth into her mouth when she was too weak to feed herself, and changed the dressing on her wound with a touch that was surprisingly tender. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a deep, abiding kindness that touched her in a way that words never could. In her lucid moments, she would watch him as he moved about the small cabin, his large frame filling the confined space. He was a man who was at home in the wilderness, his movements sure and steady, his knowledge of the land encyclopedic. He would leave for short periods of time, returning with fresh game for their meals or herbs to make a soothing tea for her fever. He was a provider, a protector, a caregiver, a man who had taken it upon himself to mend her broken body and, in doing so, was slowly beginning to heal the shattered pieces of her own heart. One afternoon, she awoke to find him sitting by the fire, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. The firelight cast his rugged features in sharp relief, and she could see the weariness in the lines around his eyes, the deep, abiding sadness that seemed to be a permanent part of him. He had not slept in days, she knew, his vigil at her bedside a testament to his unwavering commitment to her well-being. "Jedediah," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and relief. He was at her side in an instant, his large, cool hand on her forehead. "Your fever's broken," he said, a smile touching his lips for the first time since she had met him. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it transformed his face, chasing away the shadows and revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been before life had carved its harsh lines into his soul. "Thanks to you," she said, her voice stronger now. "You saved my life." He looked away, a flush of color rising in his sun-weathered cheeks. He was a man who was uncomfortable with praise, a man who did what needed to be done without expectation of thanks or reward. "I'm hungry," she said, the first pangs of hunger a welcome sign that she was finally on the road to recovery. A wide grin spread across his face, a genuine, unforced smile that made her heart do a little flutter. "I've got some rabbit stew," he said, his voice full of a boyish enthusiasm that was at odds with his formidable size. "It's not much, but it's hearty." He helped her to sit up, his arm a steady support at her back. He brought her a bowl of the stew, the rich, savory aroma, a welcome change from the bland broth she had been subsisting on for days. She ate with a ravenous appetite, her body craving the nourishment it had been denied for so long. He watched her eat, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. He was a man who took pleasure in the simple things, a man who found joy in caring for others. He was a gentle giant, a man whose gruff exterior concealed a heart of gold. "Tell me about her," she said, her voice soft. "The woman you knew." He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by the familiar sadness that seemed to be his constant companion. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "She was my wife." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a grief that was almost palpable. He had loved and lost, and the pain of it was still a raw, open wound. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice a gentle whisper. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick, with a pain that seemed to come from a place deep within him. "It was my fault," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I was a lawman back then, a U.S. Marshal. I made a lot of enemies." He paused, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at her then, his eyes full of a self-recrimination that was a physical blow. "One of them came after me," he continued, his voice a low, deadly growl. "But he found her instead." The words hung in the air, heavy with a grief and a guilt that was almost suffocating. He blamed himself for his wife's death, and the weight of it was a burden he carried with him every day. "It wasn't your fault," she said, her voice a soft murmur. He shook his head, a bitter, self-deprecating laugh escaping his lips. "I should have been there," he said, his voice full of a despair that tore at her heart. "I should have protected her." He had failed the woman he loved, and now he was trying to atone for that failure by protecting her. She was his chance for redemption, his opportunity to silence the ghosts of his past. "You're protecting me," she said, her voice a gentle whisper. He looked at her, his eyes full of a fierce, protective light. "I won't let what happened to Sarah happen to you," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. "I'll keep you safe, Elara, I promise." And in that moment, in the flickering light of the fire, with the giant cowboy's solemn vow echoing in the quiet of the night, Elara knew that she had found more than just a protector. She had found a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler on the lonely road of life, a man whose own brokenness mirrored her own. They were two wounded souls brought together by fate in the heart of the unforgiving West, and in each other, they just might find the healing they both so desperately sought. With each passing day, Elara's strength returned, the vibrant bloom of health slowly replacing the pallor of her illness. The wound in her side, once a fiery torment, had begun to heal, the angry red of the flesh fading to a dull pink. She was still weak, her movements slow and deliberate, but she was alive, and for that, she was eternally grateful to the gentle giant who had become her unlikely savior. She began to take short walks around the cabin, her steps unsteady at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. The desert, once a symbol of her despair, was now a place of quiet beauty. The stark, rugged landscape held a certain majesty, the muted colors of the earth and the sky, a soothing balm to her troubled soul. Jedediah was her constant companion on these walks, his large frame a reassuring presence at her side. He would point out the various plants and animals, his knowledge of the natural world a source of endless fascination for her. He was a man who was in tune with the rhythms of the land, a man who found solace and sustenance in the untamed wilderness. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, the silence between them no longer a void but a comfortable shared space. He would tell her stories of his life as a U.S. Marshal, tales of adventure and danger, of outlaws and lawmen, of a life lived on the ragged edge of civilization. He spoke of the men he had brought to justice, the lives he had saved, the choices he had made, both good and bad. She, in turn, began to open up to him, her own story trickling out in bits and pieces. She spoke of her lonely childhood in an orphanage, of her arranged marriage to Silas Croft, a man who had promised her a life of luxury and had delivered a gilded cage of misery. She spoke of his cruelty, his coldness, his casual brutality, the way he had slowly but surely chipped away at her spirit until there was almost nothing left. As she spoke, she could see the anger in Jedediah's eyes, a cold, hard fury that was directed not at her but at the man who had hurt her. He listened in silence, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. He was a man who had a strong sense of justice, a man who could not abide the mistreatment of the innocent. "He will pay for what he's done to you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I will see to it." The words sent a shiver of fear down her spine. She knew that he meant them, that he was a man who would not hesitate to put himself in harm's way to protect her. But Silas was a powerful man, a man with a long reach and a heart as cold and hard as the gold he hoarded. "No," she said, her voice a desperate plea. "I don't want you to get hurt. I just want to be free." He looked at her then, his eyes full of a fierce, protective light. "You are free," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow, "and I will do whatever it takes to keep you that way." He was her champion, her protector, a man who was willing to stand between her and the monster who haunted her past. But she did not want him to fight her battles for her. She did not want him to risk his life for her. She had been a victim for too long. It was time for her to find her own strength, to stand on her own 2 feet. "I need to learn how to protect myself," she said, her voice full of a newfound resolve. Jedediah looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He saw the determination in her gaze, the steel in her spine that had been forged in the crucible of her suffering. He saw not a victim, but a survivor, and a slow smile spread across his face, a smile of pride and admiration. "All right," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I'll teach you." And so her lessons began. He started with the basics, teaching her how to handle a pistol, how to load it, how to aim, how to fire. He was a patient teacher, his instructions clear and concise, his large hands guiding her as she learned to handle the unfamiliar weight of the weapon. At first she was clumsy and hesitant, the loud report of the gun making her flinch, but with each passing day her confidence grew, her aim becoming truer, her hand steadier. She was a quick learner, her determination to master the weapon a driving force. He also told her how to track, how to read the signs of the land, how to move through the wilderness without leaving a trace. He taught her how to find water, how to build a fire, how to survive in the harsh, unforgiving environment of the desert. As she learned, she felt a sense of empowerment, a growing confidence in her own abilities. She was no longer a helpless damsel in distress, but a woman who was learning to take control of her own destiny. She was a student of the wilderness, her teacher a gentle giant who was not only teaching her how to survive, but also how to live again. And as they spent their days together, a bond began to form between them, a connection that went deeper than that of a teacher and a student, a protector and a protected. It was a bond forged in shared experience, in mutual respect, in the quiet understanding that passed between 2 people who had both known pain and loss, and had found in each other a reason to hope again. The desert, once a place of desolation, had become a sanctuary, a place of healing, a place where 2 broken souls had found each other and had begun to piece their lives back together, one day at a time. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, a mournful song that seemed to echo the ache in Elara's heart. She stood at the edge of the grove, a pistol holstered at her hip, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The setting sun painted the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, a breathtaking spectacle that did little to soothe the turmoil in her soul. It had been weeks since she had stumbled into Jedediah's life, weeks of healing and learning, of quiet companionship and unspoken emotions. The physical scars were fading, the memory of the pain a dull, distant echo, but the emotional wounds were still raw, the fear of Silas a constant, nagging presence at the back of her mind. She had grown stronger, both physically and mentally. She could now shoot with a steady hand, her aim true and accurate. She could track a jackrabbit through the dense undergrowth, her eyes sharp and observant. She could build a fire with a single match, her hands no longer clumsy and hesitant. She was a survivor, a woman who had been forged in the crucible of adversity. But she was also a woman in love. It had happened slowly, insidiously, a gradual unfolding of her heart like a desert flower blooming in the moonlight. It was in the way he looked at her, his eyes full of a fierce, protective tenderness. It was in the gentle touch of his hand as he guided her aim, the low rumble of his voice as he shared his stories by the fire, the quiet strength of his presence that made her feel safe and cherished. She loved him. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Terrifying because she knew that her love for him put him in danger. Silas was a jealous and possessive man, and if he ever found out about her feelings for Jedediah, he would not hesitate to destroy them both. Exhilarating because for the first time in her life she had found a man who was worthy of her love, a man who saw her not as a possession but as a partner, an equal. Jedediah emerged from the cabin, his large frame a reassuring silhouette against the fading light. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the dry earth, his gaze full of a question he didn't dare to ask. "You're troubled," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. She didn't deny it. He knew her too well. He could read her like an open book, his perceptive eyes seeing past the walls she had built around her heart. "I'm afraid," she confessed, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I'm afraid for you." He stopped in front of her, his large frame so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice a soft murmur. "I can take care of myself." "But you don't know Silas," she said, her voice full of a desperate urgency. "He's a monster. He'll stop at nothing to get what he wants." "And what is it that he wants?" Jedediah asked, his gaze searching hers. "He wants me," she said, her voice trembling. "But not because he loves me. He wants me because I'm his property, his possession, and he will not tolerate anyone else having what belongs to him." Jedediah's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing with a cold, hard fury. "You are not a possession," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You are a woman, a strong, beautiful, courageous woman, and you belong to no one but yourself." His words were a balm to her wounded soul, a validation of the person she was becoming. He saw her, truly saw her, and in his eyes she saw not a broken toy to be possessed, but a woman to be cherished and adored. "I love you, Jedediah," she whispered, the words a torrent of emotion that could no longer be contained. A look of stunned surprise crossed his face, followed by a wave of an emotion so profound, so overwhelming, that it took his breath away. He had not dared to hope, had not allowed himself to dream, that she could ever feel for him what he felt for her. "Elara," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He lowered his head and kissed her, a tender, tentative exploration that quickly deepened into a passionate, all-consuming embrace. It was a kiss of shared pain and shared hope, of two broken souls finding solace and healing in each other's arms. The world fell away, the desert and the sky and the whispering wind all fading into insignificance. There was only the two of them, two people who had been brought together by fate and had found in each other a love that was as vast and as timeless as the land itself. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding in a frantic, syncopated rhythm. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "I love you too, Elara," he whispered, his voice a hoarse, ragged thing. "I think I have from the moment I first saw you, a broken angel in the dust." The words were a song to her heart, a melody of hope and promise in the quiet of the desert night. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, two souls intertwined, their love a beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. But even as they clung to each other, a shadow loomed on the horizon, a harbinger of the storm that was to come. For in the town of Blackstone, a ruthless cattle baron was growing impatient, his desire for his runaway wife turning into a cold, murderous obsession. And he had dispatched his hounds, a pack of ruthless bounty hunters, to track her down and bring her back to him, dead or alive. The fragile peace they had found was about to be shattered, their love put to the ultimate test in the crucible of violence and revenge. The tranquility of their desert sanctuary was shattered by the distant rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats. It was a sound that had haunted Elara's nightmares, a sound that spoke of pursuit and capture, of a past that refused to let her go. She and Jedediah exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the danger that was fast approaching. "They found us," she whispered, her voice a tight knot of fear. "Stay here," Jedediah commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. He grabbed his rifle from its scabbard on his saddle, his movements quick and economical. He was a man of action, a warrior ready to defend his own. "No," she said, her voice full of a newfound resolve. She unholstered her own pistol, the cool, hard steel a reassuring weight in her hand. "I'm with you." A flicker of pride and admiration crossed his face. He gave a curt nod, his eyes blazing with a fierce protective light. "Stay close," he said, his voice a low, steadying rumble. They took up positions behind a cluster of large boulders at the edge of the grove, the natural rock formation providing a perfect defensive position. From their vantage point, they could see the riders approaching, a group of 5 men, their faces hard and cruel, their eyes cold and merciless. They were bounty hunters, a pack of human wolves sent to do Silas Croft's bidding. The lead rider, a man with a scarred face and a sneer that was a permanent fixture on his lips, reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the grove of cottonwood trees. He had the cunning eyes of a predator, a man who could smell fear and desperation. "Come on out, little lady," he called out, his voice a gravelly sneer. "The boss wants a word with you." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But she did not cower, she did not tremble. She held her pistol steady, her finger on the trigger, her gaze fixed on the man who was the embodiment of her darkest fears. "She's not going anywhere with you," Jedediah's voice boomed out, a low, dangerous growl that echoed through the quiet of the desert. The scarred man's sneer widened. "And who might you be, friend?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "I'm the man who's going to send you to hell if you don't turn around and ride out of here," Jedediah replied, his voice as cold and hard as the steel of his rifle. The bounty hunter laughed, a harsh grating sound that set Elara's teeth on edge. "Big words for a man who's about to die," he said, his hand moving towards the pistol holstered at his hip. But Jedediah was faster. The report of his rifle cracked through the stillness, and the bounty hunter's hat flew off his head, a clean hole punched through the brim. The man's eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and fear, his hand freezing in midair. "The next one goes between your eyes," Jedediah said, his voice a low, deadly promise. The bounty hunters exchanged nervous glances, their bravado evaporating in the face of Jedediah's unwavering resolve. He was not just a man, he was a force of nature, a giant who was not to be trifled with. "He's bluffing," one of the other men said, his voice a nervous whisper. "There's only 2 of them." But the scarred man was not so sure. He had seen the look in Jedediah's eyes, the cold, hard certainty of a man who was no stranger to violence. He had also seen the woman, her face pale but determined, her hand steady on the pistol. This was not going to be the easy job he had been promised. "Let's go," he said, his voice a low growl of frustration. He wheeled his horse around, his pride stung but his life intact. The other men followed suit, their retreat a cloud of dust and muttered curses. Elara watched them go, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and adrenaline. They were gone for now, but she knew that this was not the end. It was just the beginning. Silas would not give up so easily. He would send more men, more ruthless, more determined. He would not rest until he had her back in his clutches. Jedediah lowered his rifle, his gaze fixed on the retreating figures. He knew that this was a temporary victory, a brief respite in a war that was far from over. He had made a promise to Elara, a vow to protect her, and he would not break it. He would stand between her and the darkness, a shield against the storm that was gathering on the horizon. He turned to Elara, his eyes full of a fierce, protective love. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. She nodded, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Thanks to you." He pulled her into his arms, his embrace a haven of safety and warmth in the cold, unforgiving desert. She buried her face in his chest, the steady beat of his heart a comforting rhythm against her ear. "I won't let them take you," he whispered, his voice a solemn vow. "I'll die first." And in that moment, in the aftermath of the first battle in a war that was yet to be won, Elara knew that she would do the same for him. They were in this together, 2 wounded souls who had found in each other a love that was worth fighting for, a love that was worth dying for. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a team, a partnership, a force to be reckoned with, and they would face whatever came their way, together, side by side, their love a beacon of hope in the heart of the unforgiving West. The bounty hunter's retreat was not a victory, but a temporary reprieve, a lull before the inevitable storm. The air in the small cabin was thick with a palpable tension, a sense of impending doom that hung over them like a shroud. They were no longer just fugitives. They were targets, their lives forfeit in the eyes of a man who held all the cards. Jedediah was a man transformed. The gentle caregiver had been replaced by a grim-faced warrior, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his rifle. He was a man who had seen the face of evil, who knew the lengths to which a man like Silas Croft would go to get what he wanted. He and Elara spoke little, their communication a series of shared glances and unspoken understandings. They were two soldiers in a war they had not chosen. Their love for each other the only thing that kept them from succumbing to despair. One evening as they sat by the fire, the silence between them was broken by the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. It was a sound that had once been a symbol of the untamed wilderness, but now it seemed to be a harbinger of the darkness that was closing in on them. "We can't stay here," Jedediah said, his voice a low, grim rumble. "They'll be back, and next time, they'll bring more men." Elara knew he was right. Their desert sanctuary had become a trap, a cage from which there was no escape. But where could they go? Silas's influence was like a cancer, spreading across the land, his spies and informants in every town and settlement. "There's a place," Jedediah said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper, "a hidden valley deep in the mountains. It's a place where a man can disappear, a place where the law can't touch you." "An outlaw's hideout?" she asked, her voice a mixture of hope and trepidation. He nodded. "It's a long shot," he admitted, "but it's our only shot." And so their journey began. They packed what little they owned, their movements quick and efficient, their faces grim with the knowledge of what lay ahead. They were two fugitives on the run, their only hope a hidden valley in the heart of the unforgiving mountains. They traveled by night, the moon their only guide, the stars their silent companions. The days were spent in hiding in caves and canyons, their senses on high alert, their bodies weary from the constant fear and exhaustion. The journey was a crucible that tested their endurance and their resolve. They faced hunger and thirst, the biting cold of the mountain nights, the ever-present threat of discovery. But they faced it together, their bond forged in the crucible of adversity, their love for each other a flame that burned brightly in the darkness. One night, as they huddled together for warmth in a shallow cave, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. They froze, their hearts in their throats, their hands reaching for their weapons. But it was not the bounty hunters. It was a lone rider, a man on a tired-looking mule, his face etched with the lines of a long and difficult life. He was an old prospector, a man who had spent his life searching for gold in the unforgiving mountains. He was a man who had seen it all, who knew the secrets of the land, the hidden trails and the secret valleys. He shared his meager rations with them, his eyes full of a kindness that was a rare and precious commodity in this harsh and unforgiving land. He listened to their story, his face a mask of grim sympathy. "Silas Croft," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "He's a bad one, that one, a snake in the grass." He told them of the hidden valley, a place called Devil's Jaw, a notorious outlaw stronghold where the law dared not tread. It was a dangerous place, a haven for men who had no respect for the law or for human life, but it was also their only hope. He gave them a hand-drawn map, a crude but accurate guide to the treacherous mountain passes that led to the hidden valley. "Be careful," he warned them, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "The men in Devil's Jaw are not to be trusted." They thanked him, their hearts full of a gratitude that words could not express. He was an angel in disguise, a glimmer of hope in the darkness of their despair. They continued their journey, the old prospector's map their guide, their hearts full of a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer just running, they were running toward something, a place of refuge, a chance for a new beginning. The journey was arduous and fraught with danger. They navigated treacherous mountain passes, their horses struggling for footing on the narrow, winding trails. They crossed raging rivers, the icy water a shocking reminder of the power of nature. They faced down a mountain lion, its predatory gaze a reflection of the human predators who were hot on their trail. But they faced it all together, their love for each other, their strength and their shield. They were two warriors in a battle for their lives, their spirits unbroken, their resolve unyielding. They were headed for Devil's Jaw, a place of danger and uncertainty, but also a place of hope, a place where they might finally be free. The entrance to Devil's Jaw was a narrow, treacherous canyon, its walls a jagged maw of rock that seemed to swallow the light. It was a place that lived up to its name, a foreboding gateway to a world of outlaws and fugitives, a place where the law of the gun was the only law that mattered. Jedediah and Elara rode into the canyon with their hearts in their throats, their hands on their guns, their senses on high alert. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a sense of danger that was as real and as threatening as the jagged rocks that towered over them. The canyon opened up into a wide, hidden valley, a small, self-contained world that was a stark contrast to the barren mountains that surrounded it. A motley collection of rough-hewn cabins and tents was clustered around a central saloon, a hive of activity in the heart of the outlaw stronghold. Men with hard, cruel faces and guns strapped to their hips watched them as they rode in, their eyes full of suspicion and hostility. These were men who had been cast out of society, men who had no respect for the law or for human life. They were predators, and in their eyes, Jedediah and Elara were prey. They dismounted in front of the saloon, the sound of raucous laughter and tinny piano music spilling out into the dusty street. Jedediah's hand rested on the butt of his pistol, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of hostile faces. He was a man who was no stranger to danger, a man who knew how to handle himself in a fight. But here, in this den of wolves, he was outnumbered and outgunned. A large, barrel-chested man with a handlebar mustache and a mean-looking scar across his face emerged from the saloon. His eyes narrowed, his hand on his gun. He was the leader of this motley crew, the alpha wolf in this pack of predators. "What do you want?" he growled, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "We're just passing through," Jedediah said, his voice calm and steady, his gaze unwavering. "We're looking for a place to rest for a few days." The man's eyes flickered to Elara, a leering, predatory gaze that made her skin crawl. "We don't get many pretty little things like you in Devil's Jaw," he said, his voice a greasy sneer. Jedediah stepped in front of her, his large frame a shield against the man's lecherous gaze. "She's with me," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound that set Elara's teeth on edge. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his hand moving towards his gun. But before he could draw, a new voice cut through the tense standoff, a voice that was both familiar and chilling. "Well, well, well, look what the cat dragged in." Elara's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was the voice of her nightmares, the voice of the man who had haunted her every waking moment. It was Silas Croft. He emerged from the saloon, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. He was flanked by a dozen of his men, their guns drawn, their faces a mixture of smug satisfaction and cold, murderous intent. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Silas asked, his voice a low, menacing purr. "I have eyes and ears everywhere. I knew you were headed for this rat's nest the moment you left the desert." Jedediah's hand tightened on the butt of his pistol, his eyes blazing with a cold, hard fury. "You'll have to kill me to get to her," he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. Silas laughed, a high, mocking sound that grated on the nerves. "That's the plan," he said, his voice as cold as the grave. The world exploded in a maelstrom of gunfire and chaos. Jedediah shoved Elara behind him, his body a shield against the hail of bullets. He returned fire, his rifle a deadly extension of his will, his aim true and accurate, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. For every one of Silas's men that Jedediah brought down, there were two more to take his place. It was a desperate, losing battle, a last stand against an overwhelming force. Elara watched in horror as a bullet grazed Jedediah's shoulder, the impact spinning him around. He grunted in pain, but he did not fall. He was a giant, a force of nature, a man who would not be brought down easily. She raised her own pistol, her hand steady, her fear replaced by a cold, hard rage. She would not be a damsel in distress, a passive victim in this fight for her life. She was a warrior, a survivor, a woman who would not go down without a fight. She fired, the bullet finding its mark in the chest of one of Silas's men. He crumpled to the ground, a look of surprised agony on his face. She had taken a life, and the realization was both shocking and empowering. She was no longer a victim. She was a fighter. The battle raged on, a desperate, bloody ballet of death and destruction. Jedediah and Elara fought back to back, a team, a partnership, their love for each other a bond that could not be broken. But they were fighting a losing battle. They were running out of ammunition, their bodies weary from the constant fight for survival. The end was near, and they both knew it. In a moment of desperation, Jedediah did the only thing he could do. He shoved Elara towards the horses, his eyes full of a fierce protective love. "Go," he shouted, his voice a raw, desperate command. "Get out of here." "No," she cried, her voice a heart-wrenching sob. "I won't leave you." "Go," he repeated, his voice a roar of desperation. He turned to face Silas, a look of grim determination on his face. "It ends now," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl. He charged at Silas, his body a battering ram, his rage a force of nature. He was a man with nothing left to lose, a man who was willing to sacrifice himself to save the woman he loved, but Silas was ready for him. He raised his pistol and fired, the bullet striking Jedediah in the chest. The giant cowboy stumbled, a look of surprised agony on his face. He fell to his knees, his lifeblood staining the dusty ground of Devil's Jaw. Elara's scream was a raw, primal sound of grief and despair. The world had ended. Her heart had been torn from her chest, her reason for living extinguished in a single, brutal moment. Silas laughed, a triumphant demonic sound that echoed through the canyon. He had won. He had destroyed the only thing that stood in his way. He had reclaimed his property. He walked towards Elara, a cruel, possessive smile on his face. "You're mine now," he said, his voice a low, menacing purr. "Forever." But as he reached for her, a new sound cut through the air, a sound that was both unexpected and welcome. It was the sound of a bugle, a clear, sharp call to arms that echoed through the canyon. And then they came, a troop of U.S. Marshals, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the drab colors of the outlaws' clothing. They rode into Devil's Jaw with their guns drawn, their faces a mixture of grim determination and righteous fury. They had been led here by the old prospector, the angel in disguise who had not only given them a map, but had also ridden for help. He had saved them, a glimmer of hope in the darkest of moments. The outlaws, caught between the marshals and the remaining forces of Silas Croft, scattered like rats from a sinking ship. The tide had turned. The battle was not yet over. Silas's face was a mask of rage and frustration. He had been so close to victory, so close to reclaiming what was his. But now, his prize was slipping through his fingers. He grabbed Elara, his arm a steel band around her throat, his pistol pressed to her temple. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice a desperate, panicked shriek. "Or the girl dies." The marshals reined in their horses, their faces a mixture of anger and frustration. They were in a standoff, a tense, deadly game of cat and mouse. But they had not counted on Elara. She was no longer a victim, a helpless damsel in distress. She was a warrior, a survivor, a woman who would not be used as a pawn in a man's game. She drove her elbow into Silas's ribs, the unexpected blow forcing him to loosen his grip. She broke free, her hand reaching for the derringer that was still tucked into her garter. She fired the small gun, making a surprisingly loud report in the sudden silence. The bullet struck Silas in the heart, his eyes widening in a look of surprised agony. He crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror finally at an end. Elara stood over him, her body trembling, her face a mask of grief and rage. She had done it. She had killed the monster who had haunted her past. She was finally free. But her freedom had come at a terrible price. She ran to Jedediah, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. He was lying in a pool of his own blood, his life ebbing away with each shallow breath. She cradled his head in her lap, her tears falling like rain on his still face. "Don't leave me," she sobbed, her voice a raw, desperate plea. "Please don't leave me." He opened his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. "Oh, I love you, Elara," he whispered, his voice a faint, reedy sound. "I love you too," she cried, her voice choked with sobs. He reached up and touched her face, his hand a gentle, caressing touch. "Be happy," he whispered, his voice a final, dying breath. And then he was gone. The world went silent, the sounds of the battle fading into a dull, meaningless roar. The sun beat down on the dusty ground of Devil's Jaw, a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded. Elara sat there for a long time, cradling the body of the man she loved, her heart a shattered, empty thing. She had won her freedom, but she had lost her soul. The gentle giant who had saved her, who had taught her how to live again, was gone, and she was alone once more in the heart of the unforgiving West. The U.S. Marshals, led by a stern-faced man named Marshal Thompson, were a whirlwind of efficient professional activity. They rounded up the remaining outlaws, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and weary resignation. They had cleaned out a nest of vipers, but the victory was a hollow one, tainted by the loss of a good man. Marshal Thompson approached Elara, his hat in his hand, his eyes full of a sympathy that was both genuine and respectful. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Jedediah was a good man, one of the best." He had known Jedediah, had served with him in the U.S. Marshals. He spoke of his courage, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to justice. He was a legend, a man who had left an indelible mark on the untamed West. Elara listened in a daze, the Marshal's words a distant, meaningless drone. The only reality was the cold, still body of the man she loved, the gaping hole in her heart that would never be filled. They buried him on a small knoll overlooking the valley, a simple wooden cross marking his final resting place. The old prospector, whose name she now knew was Zeb, fashioned the cross himself, his gnarled hands surprisingly deft. He was a man of few words, but his eyes were full of a deep, abiding sadness. He had lost a friend, a man who had shown him a kindness he had not known in a long, long time. Elara stood by the grave, a solitary figure in a black dress that Marshal Thompson had procured for her from one of the more respectable, albeit deceased, women of Devil's Jaw. The wind whipped her hair around her face, a mournful lament for a life that had been cut short, a love that had been tragically extinguished. She was a widow once more, but this time the grief was a raw, physical ache that threatened to consume her. She had loved Jedediah with a depth and a passion she had never known, and his loss was a wound that would never heal. Marshal Thompson offered to escort her back to civilization, to a town where she could start a new life, a life free from the shadows of her past. But she refused. She could not leave him. She could not abandon the man who had given his life for her. She would stay here in this wild, untamed land, a place that was now a part of her, a place that held the memories of the man she loved. She would build a life for herself, a life that would be a testament to his courage, his kindness, his gentle spirit. Zeb, the old prospector, decided to stay with her. He was a lonely old man, his dreams of gold long since faded. He had found a new purpose in life, a new reason to live. He would be her protector, her friend, her family. Together they would build a life in the shadow of Devil's Jaw, a small pocket of civilization in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. They would build a ranch, raise cattle, and create a legacy of their own, a legacy of hope and resilience in a land that was both beautiful and brutal. The days that followed were filled with hard work and quiet grief. They built a small cabin, a home that was a testament to their shared determination and their unwavering bond. They cleared the land, planted a garden, and purchased a small herd of cattle with the money that Marshal Thompson had given her, a reward for her role in bringing Silas Croft to justice. Life was hard, the work backbreaking, the loneliness at times overwhelming, but there was also a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction in building something new from the ashes of their shattered lives. In the evenings, Elara would walk to Jedediah's grave, the simple wooden cross a silent sentinel against the fiery hues of the setting sun. She would talk to him, her voice a low, soft murmur, her words a torrent of love and loss, of hope and despair. She would tell him about her day, about the new calf that had been born, about the fence that Zeb had finally finished. She would tell him how much she missed him, how much she loved him, how his memory was a constant guiding presence in her life. And in the quiet of the desert night she would sometimes feel his presence, a gentle breeze that caressed her cheek, a whisper in the rustling leaves of the cottonwood trees. He was with her, always, his love a beacon of light in the darkness of her grief. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a pioneer, a woman who was carving out a new life for herself in the heart of the untamed West. She was a woman who had known great love and great loss, a woman who had been forged in the crucible of adversity and had emerged stronger, more resilient, more determined than ever before. He was Elara Stone, a name she had taken in honor of the man she loved, a name that was a symbol of her new life, her new identity. She was a woman of the West, a woman who had found her home, her purpose, her destiny, in the shadow of a mountain called Devil's Jaw, and in the memory of a gentle giant who had taught her how to love, how to live, and how to be free. Years passed, the seasons turning in a slow, inexorable rhythm. The desert bloomed and faded. The mountains stood as silent sentinels, and the small ranch in the shadow of Devil's Jaw flourished. The single cabin had grown into a sprawling homestead, a testament to the hard work and determination of a woman and an old man who had found in each other a family. Elara was no longer the frightened, wounded woman who had stumbled into Jedediah's life. She was a woman of substance, a woman of strength, her face etched with the lines of a life lived to the fullest, her eyes full of a wisdom that had been earned through hardship and loss. She was the matriarch of a small but thriving community, a beacon of hope and resilience in a land that was still wild and untamed. Zeb was her right-hand man, her confidant, her friend. His gnarled hands were still surprisingly deft, his knowledge of the land a source of endless wisdom. He was a grandfather figure to the small but growing number of families who had been drawn to the valley, seeking a new life, a fresh start, a place where they could be free. The valley was no longer a haven for outlaws. It was a sanctuary for pioneers, a place where people from all walks of life had come together to build a community, a town. They called it Stone's Throw, a name that was both a tribute to the man who had given his life for it and a testament to the enduring power of his legacy. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, Elara sat on the porch of her cabin, a cup of coffee in her hand, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. A group of children were playing in the dusty street, their laughter a joyful melody in the quiet of the evening. A young man approached her, his hat in his hand, his face a mixture of respect and admiration. He was the son of one of the first families to settle in the valley, a young man who had grown up listening to the stories of the gentle giant who had saved them all. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble, "we were wondering, would you tell us the story again?" Elara smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. It was a ritual, a tradition, a way of keeping the memory of Jedediah alive, a way of passing on his legacy to the next generation. She took a deep breath, her eyes full of a distant, wistful light. "It all started with a bullet," she began, her voice a low, soft murmur. "A bullet and a promise." And as she spoke, the story of the wounded widow and the gentle giant came to life once more. A tale of love and loss, of courage and sacrifice, of a love that was as timeless and as enduring as the land itself. The children gathered around her, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and wonder. They listened to the story of the man who had been a lawman and a legend, a man who had been a protector and a friend, a man who had been a hero. And as Elara spoke, she could almost feel his presence, a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves of the cottonwood trees, a whisper in the wind that carried his name. He was with her, always, his love a guiding star in the vast open sky of the American West. She had found her peace, her purpose, her home. She had found it in the heart of a community that she had helped to build, in the love of a family that she had created, in the memory of a man who had taught her the true meaning of love, of sacrifice, of freedom. The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky ablaze with the last fiery vestiges of the day. The children dispersed, their hearts full of the story of the gentle giant, their minds full of the lessons of his life. Elara sat on the porch, a solitary figure in the fading light, a gentle smile on her lips. She had lived a full life, a life of purpose, a life of meaning. She had known great love and great loss, and she had emerged from the crucible of her suffering not broken, but whole. She was Elara Stone, a woman of the West, a legend in her own right. And as the first stars began to appear in the vast, dark expanse of the sky, she whispered a single, silent prayer to the man who was her guardian angel, her gentle giant, her forever love. "Thank you, Jedediah," she whispered, her voice a soft, gentle breeze in the quiet of the desert night. "Thank you for everything." And she knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as abiding as her love for him, that he had heard her.